bits and for choosing to spend this 20 minutes with me. It always means a lot to see folks in the room when you're giving a talk, but especially after 2.5 years since the real, my last real conference, it means even more to see you here today. So thank you very much. We've got a little bit over 1 minute before we begin. So once my clock up here clicks over, I will jump in and run with the session. I will also mention that most of my slides will have the feedback link on them, so if you wanted to type in the little URL that's down at the bottom so that it's on your phone or your laptop to give feedback at the end. SQL Bits is planting a tree for every 10 surveys that they receive, so not only is it for a good cause, there is also some sort of prizey thing that I didn't pay attention to because as a speaker I am not eligible, but if you want to be eligible to win some prizey thing, definitely complete your survey for each session that you're in. And it is 1:40, so I'm going to jump in and say thank you and welcome. Hello everyone, my name is Matthew Roach. I'm a program manager on the Power BI customer advisory team at Microsoft. I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to see you in the room to talk about Roche's Maxim. Now, if you pay any attention to me on social media, you would probably expect that Roche's Maxim is a glossy magazine with beautiful pictures of swords and stories about swords. And if that's why you're here, I am sorry to say that this is not what we're going to talk about today. I'll pause briefly to give the disappointed swords people a chance to leave the room. I would, but I'm wired so I can't actually get out. They'll stop me. What we are going to talk about is this. The simple fact that data should be transformed as far upstream as possible and only as far downstream as necessary. And if you, like me, have to Google things to figure out what they actually mean, according to the internet, a maxim is a succinct formulation of a fundamental principle, general truth, or rule of conduct. And this simple saying, which has taken on a life of its own, I am embarrassed every time that I see it quoted, but I'm learning to live with it. It basically came about as a side effect of the Saturday morning or US morning Guy in a Cube live stream that my colleagues Adam and Patrick organize each week, where week after week people were asking questions where at the heart of the answer was, where do I do the work? Where should I perform a data transformation or data manipulation to solve a given problem? And the answer, of course, is do it upstream. And the succinct formulation came in because when you're answering comments in the YouTube chat, you have a very limited number of characters. So maxims are the mother, character limits are the mother of, anyway, we'll figure that out later. But let's talk about what it actually means, why it is. We'll look at some examples and then talk about some of the benefits that you get from adhering to this general principle as much as possible, keeping in mind as well there will always be exceptions, but the exceptions tend to come into the necessary bit at the end. Now, think about this as your canonical data estate. So this, if you step back and squint, odds are the data that you're working with, the flow of the system, it looks kind of like this. Maybe it actually, come on, there. Maybe it looks something more like this, right? So no one has 3 OLTP systems in a single data warehouse in a single cube, but for the purposes of this discussion, we'll keep things as simple as possible so that we're looking at a traditional business intelligence analytics type work stream, where in my opinion, the defining characteristic of business intelligence is that you're using data for a purpose for which it was not originally intended. So those transactional systems have no idea that these reports exist or were going to exist, and that means that we need to do some significant, or typically significant, transformation to deliver the value at the end of this flow. And for the purposes of this session and the purposes of the Maxim, upstream is where the data comes from. So upstream is getting as far as you can to the ultimate source, and downstream is getting closer to the consumption, like further and further away from the source. And this may be obvious to you. I've had a couple people asking essentially, it's like which is up and which is down, so it's worth having that level set to ensure we're all on the same context. But if we think about the fundamental goal of transforming data as far upstream as possible and only as far downstream as necessary, what does that mean? And very often, the questions that we see are, I need to do this calculation. Should I do it here, or should I do it there? And this type of question you probably see a dozen times a week, or maybe a dozen times a day, depending on your role. But the general answer is, do it to the left, do it upstream. Let's look at an example. So if you have Power BI, so Power BI is your business intelligence tool that you're using. If you want to add a new column to your table in your tabular model, there are two general options that are available to you. You can use DAX to add a calculated column to your table. You could use Power Query to update the query that loads the data into that table in the first place. And you guys can shout this out. Which one is better? Power Query. It's not, it depends. The answer is, you do it in Power Query if you can do it in Power Query. And the caveat, of course, is maybe it doesn't depend, right? Maybe you as an individual, you don't have the familiarity with Power Query to do that work. Maybe it has to be quick and dirty. There are some constraints to do it further downstream in DAX, to add that calculated column in DAX. But be aware that anytime you are arguing with yourself to say, in this specific instance, it's necessary for me to do the downstream thing instead of the upstream thing, 9 times out of 10, in my experience, there is some BS organizational reason that is the necessary, and it's deferring the better solution with the addition of technical debt overall. Another example, if we step away from Power BI, or maybe look at Power BI paginated reports and SQL Server reporting services. Reporting services has this amazing capability for expressions, right? So you can put expressions into a report, which in turn you might put into a view upstream or the stored procedure that your report is getting its data from. This is another one of those examples where if you put it further upstream, you tend to have better performance, you have more opportunities for reuse, and from reuse comes maintainability, it comes consistency. It means that by putting that transformation further upstream, you are getting closer, if not to a single source of truth, but at least to having a smaller number of sources of truths. So when, in this little box here, when might it be necessary to put your logic in the model or in the report itself? How about a measure, right? So if you think about measures that are part of a DAX model, measures are context sensitive, and that context is dependent on the interactions of a user with a report at render time, at runtime. So this basically means that the logic that goes into a measure, and there are examples of this for expressions and reporting services and other technologies as well, but if you're dependent on information or context that does not exist further downstream, that's where you need to, further upstream, that's when you need to put it downstream. That is necessary. You can't do in a Power Query what you could do in a DAX measure because of the inherent nature of those tools, those locations, and their functionality. The next question, of course, is, should I do it in the Power BI side of things, or should I do it in an upstream system? So should I perform that calculation in the data warehouse or in the data lake or wherever it is that my Power BI solution is getting its data from? Should you do it upstream or should you do it downstream? Everybody, I can only see the people in the middle because everything else is dark, so everybody like move your hands like this. There we go. I'm leading a dance. So if you can, those calculations should be performed and persisted in the data warehouse or the data lake or whatever that upstream system might be, lake house, warehouse, lake, some combination. By having that calculated and persisted up front, it means that not only does your refresh, but every single refresh of every model, regardless of who built it, what business processes that it supports, as long as there's that common definition of the business metric that you're calculating, the reason that you're performing that data manipulation, that data transformation in the first place, do it up where it can have more value, because the further downstream it gets, the harder it is to reuse, and that's where the spaghetti that I showed earlier, like where you've got one analytic system that gets the data from another one, and it's this daisy chain house of cards that invariably falls down. Put it up front when you can. And of course, the flip side of this, what are the common reasons to not being able to add a new column to a dimension in the data warehouse, for example? It's like, oh, this is complicated, right? Changing a data warehouse, there's a change control board, there's rigorous impact analysis, there are all of the I's that you need to dot and T's that you need to cross to make a structural change to a strongly typed production system. It's just the world that we live in, and honestly, if it's easy for you to make this change to your production data warehouse, that's a red flag too. So it may be that in a situation like this, that downstream BI system that needs the new measure, the new dimension, whatever it is, that new data, when you need it first, you may need to put it into the downstream system pragmatically, and then have that be the functional requirements or the functional prototype that feeds it back to the owners of the data warehouse so that they can then take it out, implement it upstream, and make it available as a central resource for additional systems as well. And here, in my experience, the biggest barrier is politics, because the person that owns that data warehouse is not in your reporting chain. So very often, you end up needing to work up your reporting chain until you find someone with enough authority to talk to someone on the other side of that organizational barrier to say, you need to go make this change, you need to ease this, this process so that we can have a less debt-ridden system. There's a blog, I apologize, I can't remember the woman's name who wrote it. I will look it up, and it's in one of my blogs on this topic. But there was someone who basically said it's always a people problem. So anytime that you're looking at this sort of thing, where you're trying to find the data, you're trying to make a change, you're trying to improve your overall data estate for technical reasons, technical solutions are easy. Getting the person that owns something else to acknowledge that your problem is a problem, that's the hard thing. And these two boxes here, this is where most of the situations where I have seen Roche's Maxim apply are going to be found. It's, do I put it in Power Query or DAX? You put it in Power Query unless it's a measure. Do I do it in my Power BI solution or the upstream analytics warehouse or lakehouse? You put it upstream if you can. But what about this? How do we make it so that we just don't need to transform the data, and so that the data that is being produced by the original transactional systems is fit for purpose as is? It is fit for purpose as being produced by that transactional system. Raise your hand if you've ever seen something like this. Oh my goodness, so maybe 5 to 10%. Honestly, I didn't expect any hands like this. So good on you that you are working and living in a situation where that is the case. The two examples that I've seen like this in an actual production environment, One of them was many years ago when I was doing more master data work, and there was an oil and gas company where they were spending so much correcting for bad downstream data coming from the equipment on their oil drilling platforms, oil wells. They basically were investing tens or hundreds of millions of euros to standardize the equipment across all of their oil wells so that even though they still did need to transform some data, they only needed to transform it in one consistent way. And very recently, I was working with a retail company in North America where they were in the process of getting rid of the point of sale equipment in 90% of their stores. Like, this is over 5,000 retail brick and mortar stores, where each one of them having on average 3 to 7 cash registers. So this is like major capital investment in retail where their margins are paper thin. But they recognize that by having every single cash register in every single store producing the same consistent data, they did the math and saw that they were going to come out on top in the end. It wasn't just about analytics, but analytics was a major component of this. And if we look at this simple maxim to transform data as far upstream as possible and as far downstream as necessary, there are benefits that come out in most applications, in most situations where this is applied. By pushing those transformations upstream, you tend to get better performance because you're doing that heavy lifting once. And very often, when you move it upstream, you get to choose the best place for that transformation, taking advantage of where your largest compute resources are, or maybe your cheapest compute resources are, and taking advantage of the locality of data so that it's there, you run the compute, and then the output is there as well. Cost comes in more and more as we move to the cloud. It used to be that if something ran overnight, who cared, right? Like, that's our processing window. But these days, if you're paying for CPU cycles for something that runs overnight and you get the bill at the end of the month, you deeply care about that performance, and you're transforming data once. And if you have it upstream, again, you have more choices on when that is taking place. You have benefits for both maintenance and consistency. And for me, this is two sides of the same coin, where if there's a single process producing an output, if there's something wrong, if there's something that needs to be changed, you change one thing in one place. But if you've got the same business metric being calculated in 100 different places, you're never going to get them consistent, right? If it is consistent for any period of time, it is luck more than anything else that resulted in that. Moving the transformation upstream provides the opportunities to reduce the number of places that a given transformation is applied. There are opportunities for both reusability and efficiency. So we've talked about efficiency already, but that reusability, the further upstream that you get, the fact that it is upstream, it means that more and more consumers or potential consumers are downstream, making it easier to find, to use, and to get value from. And perhaps most importantly for me, it is that you end up with a simpler data estate. Like, we're all relatively technical people. Like, we're professionals. Either we care enough to come to SQL Bits ourselves, or we work somewhere where our employers care enough to send us to SQL Bits. But being smart and experienced and all these things, it doesn't mean we need hard problems all the time. Let's make some simple problems that we can not worry about or have a junior member of our team worry about, so that we can then go find the new, interesting problems that deliver real value when we solve them. And I think Sun Tzu said that to transform data efficiently is not supreme excellence. Supreme excellence consists in having your data transformed and ready when you need it. He may not have used these exact words, but if you read The Art of War, you will find this quote in there. And I want to close by simply reiterating the maxim itself, keeping in mind for the folks that came in a little bit late and missed my disclaimer, I never expected this to take on and get a life of its own. I'm embarrassed when I see people mention it online, but I am delighted to see this basic guidance take hold and be easily communicable. So please remember that data should always be transformed as far upstream as possible. and only as far downstream as necessary. We've got 1 minute for questions. I will put the feedback up here, so please raise your hand if you have a question. You, sir. Yeah, so the question is essentially, can you take the classification of data shapes, which I'm going to paraphrase, and push that upstream so that it's consistent across a company? So the short answer is yes, that is one way to interpret this. The long answer is, I suspect that you're starting to look at master data, so like standardizing the shapes and the entities and their definition. Master data management is a much more complex domain that it feels like that question is stepping into. But at some point, people will disagree on what a customer is, like what fields do we need and what is the business concept that it represents. When you get to that point where it's like, oh, that doesn't mean that thing, then you're in a master data discussion. But if you try to push a standardized schema and definition of commonly reused data entities further upstream, that is very much what we're talking about here. And with that said, we are at time, so I want to say thank you very much. I am going to run to the BI Power Hour because that is my next session. I would love it if I see you there as well, and if not, have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.